Multirisco, uma iniciativa interinstitucional entre a Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Norte, Universidade Federal do ABC e Centro Nacional de Monitoramento e Alertas de Desastres Naturais. Este seminário é orientado para a qualificação e disseminação do debate em cenários de múltiplos riscos, sobretudo no Brasil, e tem como objetivo central contribuir com o avanço da discussão conceitual e metodológica sobre como avaliar e gerenciar contextos em que múltiplos riscos se sobrepõem. Para iniciar as atividades do dia, convidamos Sâmia Sulaiman, coordenadora do projeto Multirisco e coordenadora geral da Coordenação de Articulação do Departamento de Mitigação e Prevenção de Riscos da Secretaria Nacional de Periferias do Ministério das Cidades, para mediar a conferência intitulada Multirisco na Periferia Urbana, Divergências e Novas Intersecções nas Políticas de Habitação de Desastres. Convidamos também o Dr. Robert Coates para proferir a palestra. Robert Coates é professor no grupo de Sociologia do Desenvolvimento e Mudança na Universidade de Wageningen, na Holanda, possui formação em Relações Internacionais, Política Pós-Colonial, Desenvolvimento na América Latina e doutorado em Geografia Humana. Tem várias publicações sobre ecologia política de desastres no Brasil, ministra palestras sobre risco urbano e vulnerabilidade e tem escrito sobre governança ambiental de forma mais ampla, incluindo aspectos de neoextrativismo e conservação. Seja bem-vindo. Então, temos aqui algumas informações. Estamos com falta de água no prédio, por isso que os banheiros vão ser fechados. Esperamos que esse problema seja resolvido em breve. E voltando à nossa palestra, lembramos que após esse momento de exposição, teremos um período para comentários e perguntas do público. Boa palestra a todos.
Bom dia. É uma alegria participar desse evento como professora aqui da UFRN e atualmente dentro do Ministério das Cidades, discutindo prevenção de riscos, inclusive fazendo uma parceria com o GeoRisco para o Plano Municipal de Redução de Riscos de Natal. Então, esse evento ele congrega não só um espaço de estudo, de pesquisa, de investigação, mas principalmente de construção de capacidade técnica, acadêmica, para implementar políticas públicas que vão no sentido de prevenção, de trazer conhecimentos e refletir sobre os saberes locais para que a gente avance, de fato, para uma sociedade mais segura, mais justa, sustentável e resiliente. Nós estamos no segundo dia desse evento. Ontem tivemos um espaço muito importante de discussão e de levantamento sobre referenciais, conceitos, perspectivas metodológicas com o professor Thomas Glade, que teve uma apresentação brilhante de um repertório que faz parte de uma construção acadêmica, científica sobre a perspectiva de risco, e é fundamental que a gente reforce esse espaço e amplie as pessoas que atuam nessa temática. E a professora Carolina Martinez, que nos trouxe o contexto do Chile e como essa perspectiva de visão sobre as multiameaças, as multivulnerabilidades e os multiriscos que estão se apresentando cada vez mais com as mudanças climáticas, e ampliando a perspectiva dessas problemáticas socioambientais, como isso vem acontecendo no Chile, e também nos traz uma reflexão de como no Brasil a gente pode avançar nessa perspectiva. E hoje a gente encerra essas conferências sobre o tema, com o professor Robert Coates, trazendo uma outra leitura também importante. Isso é significativo de mostrar não só uma perspectiva internacional, mas as múltiplas perspectivas de olhar o tema do risco, que é a ecologia política, que é a governança, que é como entender também o risco a partir da lógica social e do contexto em que os territórios são construídos, as pessoas que fazem parte, a gestão pública, o repertório acadêmico que se constrói. Então, um evento pensado também para a gente refletir sobre essas perspectivas múltiplas de leitura do risco, de leitura dos territórios, para que a gente possa avançar nas pesquisas, nos estudos, na construção de uma cultura de prevenção e de segurança, para que não só a gente avance dentro do campo acadêmico e social, mas também político. Então, acho que é um momento muito fértil para a gente pensar sobre o tema e avançar nesse sentido. Então, agradeço a presença de todos e passo a palavra para o Robert Coates, que aceitou participar desse evento de uma forma também bastante primorosa. Obrigada, gente.
Bom dia, todo mundo. The presentation will be in English. I'll speak in English, mas também falo português. E trabalhei no Brasil período da minha vida. So I will say a few words in Portuguese as I go along. Thanks so much to the organizers. Thanks, Samir, for your kind introduction. Really a pleasure to be here. To Luciani for the organization, for taking charge and organizing such a inclusive event. To Fernando, that I know from UFI-ABC from some years ago, as I do Samir, and to all the other organizers, Elisa, Mariana, and others, and to our speakers from yesterday, for providing fascinating presentations that I hope to engage with in some way today, even though I provide somewhat different perspective. So my talk is entitled Multi-Risk at the Urban Periphery, Divergences and New Intersections in Housing and Disaster Policies. So I'm coming from a social science background, and my concerns are with, as I'll go on to explain, my concerns are with urban expansion, urban governance, political power, social vulnerability, these kinds of questions that I think are crucial to bring to the table when we talk about multi-risks and hazard, particularly in expanding urban areas. So the presentation looks a bit like this. My aim is to broaden knowledge on the ways in which housing and disaster risk reduction policies are connected within urban governance, while gaining insight into their impact on socio-environmental vulnerability. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a conversation, a little bit of discussion about my background, so you know something about me and my interest in Brazil over the last kind of 15, 16 years. And then I'll go on to talk about multi-risks and urban political ecology. What do these terms mean to me? I'll talk about urbanization, nature, and at-risk areas. Then I'm going to move on to housing policy, talk a bit about housing policy in Brazil, and intersections and divergences, intersections and differences with disaster risk reduction policies. And then I'm going to move on to a case study on the Região Serrana of Rio de Janeiro, which many of you will be aware has been site of repeated disasters over the last, well, actually over the last some 100 years, but particularly in the last 20 years. And I'll finish, when I talk about housing and disaster in Região Serrana, I'm going to particularly refer to processes of risk mapping and the issue of aluguel social, which has become kind of a disaster, a policy dealing with disaster. So in housing policy, in this kind of a link between housing policy and disaster risk, I'm interested in the way that disaster risk reduction has influenced housing policy, but also how housing policy, which comes from a different kind of angle, is now influencing disaster risk policy. And why the links between these are important to explore. So, yeah, my research background and themes. Well, these are just a couple of the articles I've published in the last few years, based on originally PhD work in Novo Friburgo and Teresópolis between 2012 and 2014. That was the aftermath of probably the most serious disaster that Brazil has experienced. So I've been working on Brazil for some 12 years as an academic, and actually before that as a journalist. So I've been quite connected with the Brazilian reality of urban expansion and disaster in this region. Of course, that large-scale disaster in 2011 has been followed by many further events. Since then, we can look at major landslides in the city of Rio de Janeiro. Even before that, in 2010, there were very serious landslides in Rio. Most recently in Petrópolis, also in the Região Serrana, in 2022. And I've worked with many students, supervising doctoral students from Brazil and from other locations, working on this theme, as well as on, for example, the mining tragedies in Minas Gerais and issues elsewhere. So I've been researching this for quite some time, and it's taken me to also Blumenau and places in Sao Paulo that have experienced, particularly urban peripheries that have experienced these kinds of tragedies. And sometimes I've published with Brazilians, for example, Luciana Barbosa, a colleague of mine. We published this piece in 2020, Resisting Disaster Chronopolitics on Favelas and Forced Displacement in Rio, just for you to have a kind of idea of the background that I come from. I am conscious when I talk about Rio that some things there are a bit different to the Nordeste, the Rio Grande do Norte, but also some things are similar. So I hope you find it kind of provocative and interesting to listen to a foreigner, a gringo, speaking of the Brazilian reality. My work's qualitative. It's made up of observational work, of interviews, of not just of people, of residents, although importantly of residents, but also of experts dealing with problems in those areas. So I'm very interested in the differences in the way problems are framed. You know, how do experts describe the issues happening in the urban periphery? How do residents comprehend these issues? What are the differences? What conflicts exist between different social groups over these issues? I've done many guided walks in comunidades, no Morro, many interviews there, residents showing me around, showing me where landslides happened, where they think another landslide might happen. People describing their lives, describing the challenges they face, the risks they face every day, not just environmental risks, but risks related to everyday life. So I don't know exactly who I'm talking to, but I know there's some people with some social science background here, but maybe the majority coming from more geoscience, physical geography, potentially. So I'm kind of starting by describing some of the academic background to the work I do. So really, when I talk about disasters, I come from the political ecology of vulnerability. This is associated with international authors like Ben Wisner and Blakey from the 1990s and early 2000s, people like Anthony Oliver Smith, but also Brazilians working in that theme. Not least some of the team from UFI-ABC that I'm familiar with, but some people at CEMADEM, Victor Marquezini, critical geographers in Brazil like Hermínio Maricato. I've read some of these Brazilian authors who feed into this theme. Some of the famous Brazilian geographers, Mauricio Abreu from Rio, which I'll go on to talk about. I think they all intersect with this idea of political ecology of vulnerability. That there's an issue with hazard, sure, there's an issue with environments, but there's also an issue with social change and the different groups of people that are exposed to such and vulnerable to such hazards. And this has kind of led me, my academic journey, to talk about urban governance more broadly. In expanding urban areas, are we always to look at the hazard threatening the urban area, or can we talk about the urban area as a part of nature, as having an influence on the way that hazards emerge? And how is political power kind of wrapped up in this? People like Eric Swingeder and Maria Kaika are associated with this move to urban political ecology, to think about power and vulnerability and urban change as constitutive of the world that we live in. We live in an urbanizing world. In this context, what are the risks that we're actually trying to reduce? Are we trying to reduce flood risk, earthquake risks, or should we think more about how to reduce the risk that urbanization itself produces? Just a word on urbanization as well before I go further. I think when it's translated to Portuguese, you get urbanização, but that means something slightly different, right? Because when you talk about urbanização in Portuguese, you often talk about the process of an informal area becoming formal. Is that correct? Sometimes. But I don't mean urbanization in that sense. I mean urbanization as the process of urban areas, of cities, of metropolises, sort of changing nature, okay? Laying out across nature, over nature, the process of changing a world from a more rural world into a more urban world. I'm not going to read all of this out, but I think multi-risk and multi-hazard practitioners sometimes need to step back and think about these questions of what risks we're actually trying to reduce at the base. So political ecology, ecologia politica as a field helps to unpack conflicts in the way societies and economies think about nature, the way they conceptualize nature, and why we respond to hazards and disasters in the way that we do. So I'm going to try in the presentation to tie some broader conceptual themes, some very kind of academic social science themes, to specific cases in Brazil, and I'll be very interested to hear your feedback and questions at the end. I actually had a little video clip here, but it's not really necessary to show you. So to describe, it's a 1-minute clip that describes or demonstrates the urbanization of various places in the world, right? Different kinds of environments becoming urban. And the fact that it's actually a very recent phenomenon. Is there a possibility, tem possibilidade de mostrar o clip? Or Não tem problema, senão eu vou avançar. Olha o período de tempo da mudança. Brasil aqui, mas eu acho que vocês... Oh, I'm speaking Portuguese now. There's not an example from Brazil here, but I'm sure you're kind of familiar with this process of our cities globally rapidly expanding, often into very dangerous locations. Oh. This is a global night light map that gives you a sense of where the urban areas are. This was actually from about 8 or 10 years ago. But I think it's very revealing when you think about it. You see where the most urbanized areas are, but also where other metropolises exist. You can see Sao Paulo and Rio and the northeast of Brazil. There, the urban areas along the coast. But what I mean to present by this is this question of what Neil Brenner calls planetary urbanization, that urbanization has become a planetary phenomenon, and it's very, very recent in human history. We're talking about, well, 200 years, really, since urban industrialization began, at a planetary level, but really only 60, 70, 80 years since urbanization started to expand very, very rapidly, right? It's a very recent phenomenon, and it's extraordinary. Extraordinary change in the way human societies are laid out on our planet. The other thing I want to point to in this is the sense of urbanization as development, right? As a sense of the global north or the developed world being urbanized. Urbanization as a kind of aim for humankind, yeah? And that's a political process and an economic process that points to a world in which some places have industrialized earlier, more quickly, and where the rest of the world, the global south, the developing world, so-called developing world, or the former colonial world, former colonized world, was supposed to catch up, right? So you've got the heavily urbanized world and large parts of the rest of the world that have been trying to catch up according to economic models for some 100 years. So we've got this question about urbanization as an aim, as a kind of pathway of human development for the future. So I'm kind of interested in this idea of what underpins the process of a changing environment into a changing sort of rural to urban environment. What underpins these kind of the desire for urbanization? So I think about the urban as a kind of dream, a modernizing dream about how the future of society could look, right? Sort of catch-up of poorer countries that were supposedly should become richer, developed, more sophisticated through the process of urbanization, that was the kind of dream that kind of we could leave behind rural backwardness. We could leave behind nature. We could step out of nature into a controlled environment, right? A controlled place where we can tell rivers what they're supposed to do. You know, we put in our infrastructures and say, okay, we don't want floods here, we're going to control it. A dream of control, a dream of urban control. This idea of stepping out of nature, of leaving behind rural backwardness, is incredibly powerful. And alongside this, of course, the urban environment is also an environment of consumption. It's an environment of production and consumption. And the economic models pointed to a desirable state of high production, high consumption, where effectively a cheap labor force would be available to drive forward production, progress, growth. And that was very much encouraged. I mean, if you think about the Brazilian reality of rural to urban migration, I mean, it's been encouraged over 150 years in many other states as well. This is not to idealize rural poverty. I know these situations exist, but we also have to accept that trying to leave behind rural poverty has not always brought forth urban wealth, right? This is what UN Habitat called the urbanization of poverty. Some people did very well out of urbanization. We've had creation of a huge global middle class, but also the creation of urban inequality at a very, very high level, which Brazilians will be quite familiar with. So from this kind of dream of the urban, linked to modernization theory, to the idea of trying to reach modernity, from the dream we see emerging nightmares. We see urban sprawl that just won't stop. It keeps going. It's a machine. We keep building, building, building. Unsustainable consumption, waste. Look at the waste problem from our consumption. Low biodiversity in urban environments. Numerous experts trying to address this. High inequality, the urbanization of poverty. Concentrated disaster vulnerability. What does that mean? Generally, poorer people living in places where disasters are going to happen. And my point is that the disasters are going to happen not because of the heavy rain, but it's because of the expanding urban environment, because they're bound to happen. Limited planning, planning that can't keep up with the urbanization process. Limited income in many areas, limited access to political power. What I've called the ecology of citizenship in some of my writing. People that don't have the power to influence the experts, right? I've pointed to the need for more conversation, more contact between experts and the periphery, which I think exactly this project aims to do. I wanted to turn to the Brazilian reality and reflect on even the 19th century. And I hope I don't offend anyone by doing this, but the urban change in Brazil, certainly in the 19th century, was influenced by this idea of higienização, right? Especially if you turn to Rio de Janeiro, you see, histories of very influential political figures from 100 years ago, 130 years ago, like Pereira Passos, who drove forward the urban dream in Brazil, right? And it was exactly about reaching urban modernity. It was actually, exactly about this kind of urban dream of stepping out of nature, stepping out of rural poverty, trying to produce a modern city, a city that could be hygienic, right? That could be rationally understood, ordered. A city that could order its human population, rationally observed, rationally maintained, not hazardous. It's exactly what Mauricio Abreu wrote about in 1987 and 1994. And of course this led to a state role in violent hémosciences, justified for social order, justified for public health. And we might add to that increasingly environmental protection. I'm not saying it's always a bad thing, as I'll go on to talk about, but we have to be very careful when we're talking about the process of urbanization and the process of removal of populations living in at-risk areas. So Abreu in 1994 pointed to this idea of the dance of the favelas. And what he was really pointing to was a cyclical failure in urban policy in Brazil. The residents that were removed were often unable to keep up with mortgage repayments, with financiamento, unable to pay utility bills in formal areas, and this led to further favelização, that people would be evicted, be removed by the state, and then create more informal areas somewhere else. I mean, you saw this in Rio de Janeiro, people evicted from the south zone over many, many years, and recreated informal neighborhoods, comunidades in other parts of the city. So this idea of the continued reappearance of the urban poor is a kind of cyclical process that also describes how urbanization itself has unfolded, right? That the urban has expanded because people have been evicted from some areas and then resettled somewhere else because they can't manage to maintain themselves in formalized areas within the formal economy. So they're reproduced in other areas. Many of you will be familiar with the hémosciences, even of the Vargas era, the Brazilian dictatorship era, the 1970s especially, but then ongoing through the 1980s and 90s, just as more informal districts expanded. So of course, you also had the Constitution movement. I was talking with Fernando about this yesterday. The 1998 Constitution and some of its state-based, the constitutions of individual states as well, focused on land regularization, on land titling without removals. But certainly in the Rio de Janeiro context, it points to removal still being possible where there are physical risk conditions. And this is kind of the problematic I really want to point to as I go forward, that removals of people that have had increased protections in terms of land regularization can now be removed if those conditions are defined in physical risk terms. So I'll come back to the case study of Brazil, but I'm going to talk about some more general concepts as well. So urban political ecology points to this idea of nature as the constitutive outside of urban development. It's quite a grand term, and I'm going to try to describe it, vou tentar descrever em português também, porque eu acho que não é o constitutivo fora, mas é para descrever o que está considerado fora da ambiente urbana, mas o que é realmente dentro da realidade urbana. So what's considered in discourse, in how people think about the urban environment, what's considered in discourse as outside, that nature is somehow outside, as something coming in to affect the urban environment, but it doesn't think about the environment, the urban environment as nature, as a changed nature, which would actually create the kinds of problems with hazards and disasters that we see. The constitutive outside, o que está considerado em discurso fora, mas que realmente está dentro. É? Urbanização continua mudando o ambiente, criando novo ambiente que produz tragédias. And why does it produce such disasters? Well, we see ecological change, impermeability, loss of green space, risk creation. Just forget disaster risk reduction for a minute. Let's talk about disaster risk creation. And then reactive urban infrastructures. You have a problem, you have a flood, you have a landslide. Call the experts. Bring the experts in. They're going to introduce an infrastructure to deal with the problem. They react until the next flood, and then there's another reaction. But of course, there's also not just ecological change through urbanization, but also socio-political change. Spatial segregation, densification in dangerous locations, informality, lack of basic facilities and services in the periphery. So environmental risks are always faced in the context of other risks, faced in the context of risks of housing precarity, of insecure livelihoods, of citizenship inequalities. 80% of deadly landslides are in lower income countries at the urban periphery. 80%. In the parts of the world that are catching up, or supposed to be catching up, right? There's something not quite right here. So there's an issue here in that technical approaches to hazards and disasters are always mediated by socio-economic and political ecological change. The link between knowing where dangerous places are and actually having better policies on housing, on urban development is not automatic. Having a risk map doesn't mean the problem is solved. What about the agencies that are implementing, making the decisions, implementing the policy? What do the people do themselves? How do they negotiate removal? How do they negotiate the areas in which they live? What are the results of this? What are they going to do in their new areas? My point is that these are not just technical problems, these are very social problems, very political problems. And just to flag this up, the constitutive outside. The focus, of course, in disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction, is to focus on the constitutive outside, right? We've built these amazing centers of monitoramento, yeah? Where we can watch nature. We can see it out there, the performance of nature. Let's watch climate. Let's watch the rain. Let's watch seismic activity. Let's keep an eye on it. Try and predict what's going to happen and try and produce emergency responses. In flagging this, I'm not saying I'm completely against all of this, but I'm flagging the sort of irony of it, right? We've got expanding urban areas. They're increasing so rapidly, changing nature, producing disaster. And our response is to sit there and watch nature, right? Where does all this lead us? There's a lot more. I'm sorry for the heavy text on the slides, but there's so much I wanted to talk about. Housing policy and disaster risk reduction, intersections and divergences. Well, housing policy is obviously critical in urbanizing environments. So much so that UNDRR started to talk about housing policy in its disaster risk reduction policies from 2005 in the Hyogo Framework for Action, and that continued in the Sendai Framework. States should commit to DRR, disaster risk reduction, right, and constitutional rights to appropriate housing, to people to have appropriate housing. So through DRR activity, we should commit to appropriate housing, secure housing, and the stakes arising due to climate change. But what's really interesting to me is that there's a kind of gap between, I mean, if you look at literature on housing policy, it doesn't automatically talk about disaster risk reduction, right? Housing policy was a sort of a separate domain linked to how do we make the urban environment better, or how do we provide appropriate housing for people, for a sort of socio-political reality, not an environmental reality. Yeah? So this link between housing and disaster, I think, is quite interesting in the way these policies are kind of framed. So few authors on housing policy talk about the impact on disaster vulnerability, even though we know that expanding urban environments are increasing disaster and increasing the frequency of hazards. But then you see sort of new literature linked to climate change emerging, where they talk about a need for the greening of housing, for making housing more environmentally friendly, for climate resilience. Or, on the other hand, housing as a sort of producer of flood vulnerability, that again sort of pointing to often areas of poor housing as producing problems. There's a kind of contradiction in the literature here when you think about environment and housing. So coming back to Brazil, in fact, loteamentos, that's housing subdivisions, and comunidades or favelas have been tolerated. If we look at urban expansion in numerous places in Brazil, I mean, of course they're tolerated. If they weren't tolerated, they wouldn't have been allowed to construct, right? Precisely because comunidades were actually, and loteamentos were actually inevitable or necessary in the housing crisis brought by urban growth. I'm sure some of you have some things to say on this topic. If you want a rapidly urbanizing, rapidly industrializing urban environment, you need a cheap labor force, right? You need urban settlement. I know this isn't always planned, but it's certainly been tolerated. Subdivisions, loteamentos and comunidades have been in some ways seen as a housing solution, right? And various laws and practices have protected informality in the urban environment. E.g., you know, the right to land if you've lived for 5 years or longer in your location, what you might call squatters' rights in English. But on the other hand, in formal areas, comunidades, some loteamentos, semi-legal loteamentos, many of these remain illegal and are treated as a problem. So you've got the urban periphery on one hand as a sort of solution to the problem of housing. You can't provide housing for everyone. You need a workforce, a sort of a housing solution. On the other hand, many of these areas are treated as a problem, as an environmental risk, as a hygienic risk, as various kinds of risks. So many authors, more in critical geography, critical social science, but not only there, have pointed to the fact that removal programs are repeated ad infinitum. Again, it's the dance of the favelas for Mauricio Abreu. But increasingly now legitimized by disaster or climate adaptation, and that's what I wrote about with Luciana Barbosa. Sort of new dynamic of the environment, environmental change, hazards, climate, influencing a very political process that's been going on for 150 years, where favelas repeat ad infinitum. So just to conclude this section, I want to point to the fact that there are increasing use of disaster risk reduction policies to address housing, e.g. risk mapping and assessing where people live in hazardous situations, and of housing policies, conversely, that are used to address disaster risk reduction. Minha casa, minha vida, not a disaster policy per se, but is being used now for many years to address the issue of disaster risk. And, importantly, social rent, aluguel social. Increasingly, it's a housing mechanism, a housing policy mechanism, not invented to deal with disaster, but is now being used to deal with disaster, right? To deal with this problem of people, poorer people living in at-risk locations, how to try to formalize them, to remove them from those locations, and offer some sort of subsidy, some form of safe ability to pay rent in the formal housing market. It's a market approach. Linked to housing rights, yeah? So that's the policy side, but then theoretically I start to think about, well, what does this mean for the constitutive outside of nature in the city? I've put, this represents, in a sense, a logic of urbanization as a process where disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management policies try to act on nature, but they've failed to recognize the socio-political realities of the spaces in which they are mobilized, because they're acting on the constitutive outside. They're not acting on the political realities of people living in these places. And conversely, housing policy that's been a long time trying to act on socio-political realities, but fails to recognize the ecology or the nature of the spaces in which they are mobilized. I hope I've got your brains whirring. It's early in the day. So, let's turn to housing and disaster in the Região Serrana. So, this is where I lived for a year in Novo Friburgo in 2012, 2013. So end of 2012, most of 2013. And then visited a number of times after that. So I was kind of interested in what happened after 2011. What's the state response to a devastating devastating tragedy. What I actually discovered when I looked in the history books and talked to residents was that flood risk and landslide risk was not new at all. I mean, there were 1,000 deaths in the Hejian-Sahana in 2011. Something around 30,000 people made homeless. About half of the casualties were in Novo Friburgo, about 500 deaths in a city of 170,000 people. That's a very, very high number of fatalities in a fairly small city. But also significant casualties in Teresopolis, Petropolis, and other places. An estimated 4.8 billion reais in damages. And what I also discovered in 2013 and 2014, that there were more landslides, that actually every year there were landslides. I hadn't realized this. And the most significant landslide event since that time was in February 22, with 220 deaths in Petropolis in 149 landslides, many close to the city center. In fact, most of those deaths were in a small number of landslides. 5 or 6 landslides accounted for about 200 deaths. And of course, in Rio de Janeiro city as well, I mean, there's been significant landslides right across the metropole. So this was Petropolis in 2022, almost exactly 2 years ago. I think it was end of February 2022. So I had a student that was researching similar to what I did in Novo Friburgo some years earlier. A student of mine was in Petropolis looking at the response and looking at how residents were dealing with these problems. So this is Morro da Oficina in the Alto da Serra district of Petropolis, where one landslide destroyed 80 houses, killing 90 people. I've put there for some 50 years in Petropolis, rural to urban migration has been largely unregulated in Petropolis. So Morro da Oficina was a previously protected area, but its settlement has been allowed to happen. It's been tolerated. It's my point, it's been tolerated precisely because it's a housing solution to the question of an urbanizing country. So just to point a little bit to the political ecological process of disaster creation. This is relevant to Morro da Oficina and also relevant to many of the places I've studied in Novo Friburgo. That so if we look back in history, after the coffee boom, so the Brazilian sort of coffee boom of the 19th century and early 20th century, so from the 1930s onwards, we can note that the plateaus and the flanks, the encostas of hills in the Atlantic forest were increasingly deforested for cattle pasture that has led to erosion and increased flood risk. So there's a bunch of authors, more from ecology, that point to this process. So the process of urbanization, again, pointing to an ecological process, a process of changing land occupation, changing land use, but not just in the urban area, but around the urban area. Okay? Remember the constitutive outside. So Morro da Oficina is an example of this. Residents, if you speak to residents, and actually many professionals, they will tell you that landslides are totally natural without understanding the social processes that created the landslide. So if you look at satellite imagery, and I'm going to show you some from Novo Friburgo in a moment, you can see deforested plateaus with rainwater easily infiltrating soil and rocks and mass cover on overloaded flanks then brought down. And there are people in this room far more experienced on the physical geography of landslides than I. So I'm interested to hear what Thomas has to say. But I've read enough to be quite sure on this process in the Atlantic forest in Brazil. So while you have deforestation of the plateaus and part of the flanks of hillsides, you then have hillside construction, right? Developers take advantage of absent land governance and pressure for cheap housing to clear at-risk land and subdivide it to sell for self-build homes. Now in Novo Friburgo, it's mostly loteamentos. You know, there seems to be a very unclear line there, and I don't know about Natal, but a very unclear line between what is a loteamento and what is, in effect, a favela or comunidade. Because it seems the legal status of many of these locations is very unclear. And in Novo Friburgo, and indeed in Petropolis, you not only have the subdivision of the land and then the construction, but then the creation of economies in the city where you have people working as in self-employed confecção industry, the textile industry. In both Petropolis and Novo Friburgo, this is very evident. So people whose livelihoods are based in their homes in dangerous places. Now this is what many authors on social vulnerability point to. The fact that the disaster for them is not just losing the home, but often losing your livelihood because you're not working outside of your home. You don't necessarily have the assets to then buy new equipment, buy new material. So the disaster is concentrated through the physical environment, but also the socio-economic and political environment in which people are making a living. And what I found, and indeed that will of course be familiar to many of you, is that municipalities had legalized these developments. They'd legalized the loteamentos in order to collect local government tax and to enhance the vote base of specific administrations. And this is the urbanization process, right? This is about increasing urban areas, about having political power, economic power, a labor force, an urban world expanding that can kind of contribute to the state. So let's look at some Google Earth images from Novo Friburgo. I particularly want to point to, this is actually central Novo Friburgo. I want to point to where some of the most serious landslides were initiated. Up here, where you had scores of deaths, about 50 deaths around here. That plateau completely deforested, it's cattle pasture. You have an overloaded flank. And then you have landslides initiated, people living all around here. This is political ecology, right? Understanding the ecology of the land, but the political basis of the decisions and the responses made to these problems. Here you had an ex-mayor of Novo Friburgo constructing some sort of dwelling up here. Might even have been a conference center. And the landslide initiated exactly from this place in an overloaded flank, an overloaded encosta. This was Prainha district, 60 deaths. Look here, this is 2010. The flank of the hillside completely deforested. They all bought their houses, this was actually more of a middle-class development, actually. So the majority of deaths were in much poorer areas, but this was an exception. People had paid a lot of money because they thought they were living in nature, right? Just on the very edges of Novo Friburgo. They thought, what a beautiful environment, the forest is surrounding me. Actually, the plateau and the other flanks completely deforested. An overloaded flank again that completely collapsed under heavy rain. Of course, the rain is not incidental to this, but my point is it's bound to happen, right? If you start to blame the rain, you're perhaps heading on the wrong train of thought. Duas Pedras district, poorer neighborhood. This was 2005 and 2011. This is a new loteamento under construction, 2005. This was also more of a sitio allowed to be constructed right on top of the hillside, kind of a similar process to the last Google Earth image, an overloaded flank here. Landslide initiated from those locations. Scores of casualties. And this, unbelievably, is Duas Pedras 3 years after the tragedy in 2014. So the guy that owns this sitio had lobbied for a containment project. This is a muro de contenção here, to protect the slope and protect his property, but all the people here had been evicted, all removed, said to live elsewhere. But the landslide had actually, remember, initiated from the construction on top of the hillside. And then somehow a containment project had been authorized for that location. So with my kind of inquisitive mind, I was very interested to try to talk to some land developers in Novo Friburgo. So I went to track down the leading land developer in the city from the 1980s and 90s, who was still doing some development as an older man. I've called him Sergio. It's not his real name. I think if I remember correctly, Sergio had developed 26 loteamentos around Novo Friburgo. Many, many of these had collapsed in landslides in 2011. So I discussed it with Sergio, and this was his discourse. He said he had served the poor well. He said, beforehand, before I came along and developed these locations, it was just hillside. There was nothing there at all. The 2011 tragedy was caused by the unprecedented rains, the natural disaster. A bit later on, he said, a city that doesn't grow becomes a cemetery. I presented the land, I prepared the land. The mayor said he put my name on the local school. I found Sergio kind of in denial, right? Numerous of his loteamentos had collapsed. There were hundreds of deaths. And his discourse was, I've served the poor well. There was nothing there, remember? The constitutive outside. There was nothing there on the hillsides. I came along. I created the urbanization process. I contributed to development. I contributed to the future of the country, to the growth of an industrialized society. That's what he's saying. That's the discourse. The 2011 tragedy was caused by the unprecedented rains, the natural disaster, precisely because nature is the constitutive outside. But the perspective differed from the residents. This was Sara in Código Dantas district in Novo Friburgo in 2018, in a repeat visit I did for more research. She said, "It's a serious management problem when the municipality turns a blind eye when people build. When they don't look, they tolerate it. The municipality turns a blind eye when people build, but then makes sure it collects the tax. The one thing ends up influencing the other. The ability to collect the tax influences the turning of a blind eye. But also, big commercial industries have built nearby and the workers don't want to live far away." Luis, who was in a similar district, he pointed to INEA, which is or at that time was the Rio de Janeiro Environment Agency. I believe it's been merged with another institution now. So INEA had not been visible in Código Dantas. Houses were built on top of the river and the Prefeitura had taxed them. So the government was implicated in the blame game. The INEA staff that were in the so-called social section went in and there was no dialogue. It was like, you live here, you're in a risk area, and now you will live there. You will be evicted. He went on, urban expansion is still happening in other areas that are super dangerous. They're subdividing the land there, just where new rain can create landslides. This area, and I'm going to show you in a moment, this area is being parceled out with no regulation. This loteamento is exactly where a landslide came down in 2011, and INEA implemented a partial reforestation project there, and now they've approved a new housing lot. I was very sad about this actually, because I thought if there should be one lesson from the 2011 tragedy, it should be to not approve new loteamentos in dangerous areas. But Luis took me to show this, where a reforestation project had recently been approved for a new loteamento. So then you have this question of the question of removal, the question of living in an at-risk area. It's sort of a timeless question for disaster risk reduction in urban areas because it keeps coming back, right? People live in risk areas, they shouldn't live in risk areas, and yet they're removed and then new risk areas are created, and then the experts say you shouldn't live in a risk area, and they are removed, and then a new risk area comes along in the urbanization process. So this was earlier on, this was in 2013, where 800 homes from along the central river in Novo Friburgo were to be removed. And in fact, the INEA had come along very insensitively, actually, and put red crosses on all the houses before speaking to any of the residents to label the ones that had to go. And you can imagine the sort of chaos that ensued for that neighborhood. Suddenly people woke up and found a red cross on their door. And what followed was a meeting that I attended between engineers, experts. These were experts in hydrology, experts in river flow, experts in runoff, in urban runoff, and residents. It wasn't really a big enough room. It wasn't well planned. But I found it a crazy scenario because they were talking different languages. You know, the experts were focused on the river flow. You know, these are the projections for how this river will look under this amount of rainfall. And the residents' responses were, but we've had plenty of rain, I go upstairs when the downstairs floods, I live here, my job's near here. You should speak to the prefeito that came and danced on my veranda for my vote 10 years ago. Completely different context, right? People talking about socio-political realities, people talking about realities of nature, if you like. They don't meet so easily. I'm pointing to a need for a much greater meeting between these perspectives. So risk mapping had been a process that's very, very closely linked to removal, to remoção. These were two people that lived along the river I spoke to, Wageningen. The house has been marked for demolition for almost 2 years. I told them that it didn't even flood in 2011, but they said that because the house nearby was damaged, that this is a risk area, and thus I have to go. For Natalia, there are people that have lived close to the river for 60 years, but the government's eyes were closed throughout, permitting people to live there. And now they come and say, you can't live in a risk area. This area can't be inhabited. It's too easy. And then risk mapping in Petropolis in 2022. My student that went there, that we're writing together on it, he noted that risk mapping seems to be undertaken as a disaster response mechanism, not as a disaster prevention mechanism. And again, I'm sure some of you have something to say about this. But he found, in fact, that risk mapping of Petropolis had been undertaken in 1988 after landslides, in 2003 after landslides, in 2017 after landslides, and then again in 2022 after landslides. The 2017 maps, which were quite comprehensive, they were undertaken by a consultancy from Sao Paulo. It pointed to 15,000 at-risk homes, including Morro da Oficina. This is in 2017, okay? This is 5 years before the disaster in Morro da Oficina. So nothing was done, right? Morro da Oficina was a risk area. It was mapped. Everybody knew exactly the risks. 5 years later, it all comes tumbling down. And what's the response? A risk map. The February 2022 maps included houses damaged by landslide, but also many at the fringes of the landslide site. So many that hadn't suffered a landslide, but had been next to where the landslide had occurred. So the mapping classifications, they're based on slope inclination, they're based on soil composition, based on amount of vegetation. They are comprehensive, they're trustworthy. And variables such as distance from a road to evacuate, there's some social variables in there. The idea is that qualifying and quantifying the variables informs policymakers whose decisions should not conflict with the principle of moradia adequada, the principle of the right to housing, which, as I pointed to earlier, UNDRR is particularly interested in now. So risk mapping and removal should not conflict with the principle of moradia adequada. But in practice, as risk maps are not acted on before landslides, they don't seem to be used as a preventative mechanism, but more as a response mechanism. Moradia adequada is in fact ignored, right? That's the right to housing. there was little incentive to displace people or prevent new construction, particularly from the prefeitura, because comunidades have represented a housing solution. There's no other safe space, there's a high public expense of removal, there's a need for a significant labor force in the center of the city, and it loses votes. And when you put together all those reasons together, acting on moradia adequada is not really a consideration. Minha Casa Minha Vida never really took off in Petropolis. There were some constructions, but far insufficient for what was needed, and there was no safe space for more building due to the topography of the city. So this is really a kind of extraordinary reality which is indicative of urbanization in such places, right? Informal neighborhood safety is largely neglected, but when tragedies do occur, state agencies respond with the need to save lives. So you have in the long course of time saving lives basically ignored because moradia adequada is not acted upon. And then you have a disaster, and the state responds with the need to save lives, and the lives have already gone. So failing to deliver the right to housing, to deliver moradia adequada, means accepting comunidades, which in turn contradicts the idea of disaster risk reduction under the UN's frameworks. Social rent. We're heading towards the end of the presentation, so please bear with me. Social rent. This is the process of providing a subsidy for people to be removed from at-risk areas, areas that have been mapped. So in Petropolis, 3,000 families qualified for social rent by September 2022. And I want to say, you know, I'm a critical thinker. It's not that I'm against these processes, I'm just trying to demonstrate the reality of these processes, okay? Social rent has undoubtedly helped some residents that lost homes to find a safer place to live, and it's helped some with homes that were condemned as at risk. The elderly have been prioritized, those with health problems have been prioritized. I'm not saying the policy is a disaster, but there were significant issues with it. Interviewees in 2022 point to a very large fight to be approved for social rent. The need to prove a low income and prove that you were a home owner before the disaster. Because the state can't authorize giving money for housing to people that didn't have some sort of legal ownership of their property. It's very, very difficult or impossible for residents with homes destroyed, and some people that didn't have the kind of proof that the prefeitura or the state needed. There was social rent provided by both the municipality and the state. That mechanism was rather complicated. Other interviewees mentioned how they were unable to find an apartment even when they qualified. So in effect, if you're presented with the possibility of having social rent, you're moved out of one of these locations, there's a big issue because you're in a city with a housing crisis, there's nowhere to live, so where do you go? You move to another city? You try to move to a friend's house? I mean, they don't necessarily want to have you. You couldn't receive social rent and move to Minas Gerais, the nearest state from Petropolis. Some people wanted to move further away than Rio de Janeiro, but then couldn't because the social rent didn't apply to them. People didn't want to leave Petropolis. If you lived in Petropolis all your life, you're connected with the city, the community, you maybe have a job, you maybe have kids in school. You don't want to go. Some homeowners did not accept children, did not accept pets, some of them, and some did not trust the municipality to actually pay. I think these are smaller issues, but still relevant. Remember, this is a housing policy being applied as a disaster risk reduction measure. One respondent said, "Those who don't need social rent get it, and those who need it are not getting it. There were people who had a good house. They left their house to get social rent, and people who need it and cannot get it." A civil defense employee said, "Maintaining social rent actually hides the truth. You end up saying you are helping these families to guarantee the right to housing." Remember, moradia adequada. However, social rent doesn't guarantee the right to live, because to get social rent, you need to be a homeowner. So you don't really guarantee action on housing. And what my student found, very sadly, was a return to at-risk areas. Many people returned to Morro da Oficina and other affected areas in spring 2022, unable to join aluguel social, or because they needed to stay close to jobs, schools, and places they had lived all their life. And what happens when people return to the affected neighborhood, the landslide neighborhood? When people return, they lack essential services, as condemned areas have low priority for restoring electricity and water and become more unsafe without streetlights. So you have a kind of reproduction of the urban periphery in a hazardous place, but with fewer resources and poorer conditions. And I'd actually found a similar story in Córrego d'Antas in Novo Friburgo in 2018. My interviewee, João, said, "Most condemned houses are once again occupied. Those not demolished arranged electricity and water. There is always someone to get help from, to return to live without permission. There might be another disaster because we don't have prevention." I'm kind of flagging the fact that these areas, the contradiction between them being a housing solution in an urbanizing process and being an at-risk area. For Sarah, she added, "There were more landslides in 2015 and people were evicted but went back to live there as they couldn't afford to rent elsewhere. They were simply left to re-inhabit a landslide site with one or two houses still standing in the middle. Without money, there is no way out. Some were offered an apartment far away in a place became a big center for drug trafficking. Criminal factions in favelas were put together when they were removed, causing new conflicts, so people returned." These are kind of the socio-political realities of people living in these areas. So to wrap up, I've given a lot of details today, a lot of cases, a lot of thoughts, a lot of theory. Well, firstly, there's maybe a less theoretical level, but still very relevant, multi-hazards of life, right? We're talking about multi-hazards. We're not talking just about intersections of flooding and heat. We're not just talking about river flow and physical processes on the flanks of hills. We're talking about a state, we're talking about inequality, we're talking about history, we're talking about people's perspectives, we're talking about the way people imagine the city, we're talking about social and political realities, often in cases of practicality and desperation. maybe more theoretically, as my political ecologist and geographer brain would point to, the contradictions between housing policy and DRR policy ultimately exist because the logic of urbanization, or the urban imaginary, is still trying to exclude nature. We've had housing policy as a form of urban policy for decades, but nature was never really thought about, because nature was the constitutive outside, right? It was out there, it wasn't in here. The urban imaginary. In the face of urban inequality, we aim for a political narrative of morologia adequada, of the right to housing, of citizen rights. But we're unable to maintain it in nature because the drivers of unequal and hazardous urbanization and the cycle of recurring disaster is able to persist, is allowed to persist, I should say. So understanding the physical processes of hazards, of disasters is critical, as it can help influence urban governance. But I would say I think the multi-risk focus is actually a key opportunity for more inclusive risk governance, to try to learn about and understand social political realities and not focus only on securing urbanization. So it's about learning socio-political realities, but also trying to bridge this kind of constitutive outside, right? About trying to theoretically increase the knowledge, change the way society thinks about urban areas. To think about urban areas as natural, right? It's a changed nature, but it's still nature. And it has effects. And our laws have been very slow to catch up. You know, planning laws, housing laws. They've never really thought about disaster risk. They've never thought about the constitutive outside, right? So with all of this theory, the final point I would say is that you can have your glass half full or your glass half empty. What I mean by that, you can be a pessimist or an optimist. Does the housing policy disaster risk reduction bridge embed more urban growth and actually fail to reduce disaster risk precisely because it's labeled as natural disaster, right, and not social disaster? That's the glass half empty version. Or can the housing policy DRR bridge be an effort to try to include the nature of urban space in social and political struggles for citizenship? I think climate change and the pressure it provides actually presents us with both pathways at the same time. But it's up to us as academics, as practitioners, as those working on disaster risk, to make sure the weight of this tips towards the latter and not the former, that it tips towards including the nature of urban space in political struggles for citizenship, and not to the former, not to failing to actually reduce disaster risk. Thank you very much.
Obrigada, Robert, pela exposição também bastante densa e detalhada de uma perspectiva, como eu havia comentado na abertura, de uma lógica social, política, ecológica, que precisa, sim, ser pensada e complementada nas nossas reflexões e trabalhos acadêmicos e, principalmente, de política pública. Eu queria só ressaltar alguns pontos, eu já abro aqui para duas perguntas rapidinho. O reforço que o Robert Coates traz na sua apresentação sobre o que a gente vem discutindo de construção social do risco, né, uma lógica que olha para o território, né, desconsiderando a natureza e desconsiderando as pessoas, e isso é importante da gente ter como repertório, que existem diferentes interesses e visões sobre o risco, sobre como ele se apresenta e como gerenciá-lo, e é importante trazer essa multiplicidade, principalmente das comunidades que estão em situação de risco, que o mapeamento é importante, mas ele, sem uma ação estratégica de prevenção, não tem funcionalidade, mas também pensar que tipos de intervenções vão ser exercidas que não reproduzam a mesma realidade de risco que nós estamos vivendo. Então, foi muito importante ter essa complementação, né, desde ontem, sobre essa perspectiva territorializada, complexa do risco, para que a gente avance numa lógica de multirrisco, não só técnica, mas também política e social, para avançarmos. Eu abro para quem quer fazer comentários ou perguntas. Fernando, Anderson.
Robert, grande. Essa é uma visão fundamental, né? Porque, e aí queria colocar para você comentar uma questão do conflito que você expõe de maneira fantástica, assim, o fato de que a gestão de risco justifica todas suas falhas na natureza, ou seja, responsabilizando a natureza por processos que são resultado da inadequação, da insuficiência, da insustentabilidade do desenvolvimento urbano, né? E, por outro lado, o desenvolvimento urbano refugando a natureza. Acho que essa síntese é perfeita para a gente pensar por que a gestão pública ela é tão parcelada, né? Porque um objeto chamado cidade, onde mora a maior parte dos brasileiros, ele é tratado de maneira tão fatiada, né? Fatiada de poder, fatiada de ação, né? E não existem ações integradas, transversalizadas, né? A importância da gente pensar em ação transversalizada quando a gente pensa no PMRR de Natal, né? Que não seja uma atividade exclusiva da universidade com a Defesa Civil, mas seja uma atividade da universidade com a prefeitura como um todo, né? Integrando ação social, habitação, ambiente, obras e tal. Essa questão que eu queria comentar.
Bom dia, professor. Minha pergunta ela vai mais no sentido de que a gente sempre discute aqui no Brasil o fato de que a Europa levou 300 anos para se urbanizar, mas o Brasil só levou 30 anos. E é um pouco nessa perspectiva. E eu gostaria de perguntar bem objetivamente qual a importância dos estudos históricos no que se refere à urbanização e para a compreensão dos riscos atuais. E como é que a identificação desses processos históricos, especialmente no que se refere aos aspectos sociais, econômicos e políticos, eles podem ser incorporados a metodologias de redução de riscos de desastre? A gente sente uma dificuldade em como é que a gente faz a abordagem escalar em questão de temporalidade para incorporar o aspecto histórico. Obrigado.
Obrigado pelas perguntas, pelos comentários. Tem tanta coisa, não, para falar sobre isso. Urbanização do mundo. I should probably switch to English, right, and let the translator do his very good work. Thank you. Europe took 300 years to urbanize. Yeah, I'm kind of interested. I mean, I don't have a clear answer on this kind of comment, really. But the key thing, I think, when you're talking about urbanization, you've got to have an idea of what you really mean by that, right? I mean, urbanization looks very different in different kinds of places. And I think I really fundamentally, as an opinion, think we should move away from this idea of catch-up. I think it's stale. I think it's old. This idea that there's a pathway for all human beings towards the promised land of economic high consumption production, and it applies for everyone and all states, and we should head in that direction. And unfortunately, that's what's underpinned economic theory and economic policy for 150 years. And it's now being questioned by the environmental crisis that it's brought forward. And I don't just mean disaster risk, but climate change, biodiversity loss, the civilizational crisis that we're faced with. So catch up as a trajectory of development, as modernization, is over. Sorry for those that think it's still alive, but it's over. So if there's no catch-up, then we're looking at, so I'm starting with the theory, and then I'm going to come back to disaster risk reduction, okay? But something has to change in human mentalities, in social mentalities, and I think it is changing. It's whether or not we can do that in time. Because, of course, urbanization, as I said, it's not the same thing in every place. When we think about urban areas, I'm very keen to not think about rural areas as entirely separate, because the moment you have an urban settlement, you change the area outside the urban settlement, right? You need food to feed the urban population. You need water. You need to dam a river, you know. You need electricity production. You need power. You need all kinds of things. A city, as urban political ecologists have, put emphasis on, is a process of flows. You create an urban environment, you immediately change a rural environment. So they're not separate as they are maybe in our imaginary. And that imaginary is more linked to economic development than it is about a reality in nature. Anyway, I could talk probably at length about that. But the other main part of your question, I think, was about how to make this sort of theory on urbanization more practical, more applicable to working on disaster risk reduction. I think some of the things I already mentioned, really. I think the obvious thing is that the need for very close link between experts and people living in at-risk areas. And in some places this is happening, and I applaud the MULTIRISK project for trying to bridge these worlds. But sometimes, academically, the expertise can feel a mile away from the realities of people living in these areas. And I think that has to change. That's my view. I think we need to have constant contact between experts on, rivers, on climate, on hydrology, on physical processes, and the people living in these locations, because they're acting in a political context, right? So that's the first thing, and I think that leads us to the second thing, that when we're actually applying these sorts of policies, we actually need to try to, as disaster risk professionals, we need to actually try to influence the policies that are taking place. If there's policies coming from sectors that are not on disaster risk, and for example, in Brazil, Defesa Civil has been built up. It's the key agency acting on disaster risk. But there's many other agencies that also influence disaster risk, right? But disasters then cornered in the business of the Defesa Civil are not practiced by the Secretaria de Moradia, or whatever it's called in that circumstance. Not just that, I mean, the planning, the planning department. I mean, I remember in Novo Friburgo, I was sent to, no, not sent to, I went to the urban planners that existed, and as soon as I started talking about disaster, he said, no, that's not our business, you have to go to the Defesa Civil. Yeah? And I've been pointing to the Brazilian case. I've been pointing to the Brazilian case, but this is not just Brazil. I mean, what I'm trying to point to is an urbanizing world and how this then unfolds in places of rapid urbanization, of catch-up, you know, including the Brazilian reality. So I think this using expertise on disaster risk to influence the policy process, the political process of secretarias, of government agencies that are not named as being those acting on disaster, I think that's where we should be going.
Obrigada, Robert. Então, a gente encerra, né, essa última conferência do seminário e passo para a Heloísa dar os encaminhamentos. Agradeço a presença de vocês, a presença dos nossos convidados, que fez abrilhantar a discussão sobre o tema e nos trouxe muitas inquietações, né, que também é parte do campo da ciência, da política e da sociedade, sempre rever e discutir o que nós estamos vivenciando à luz, né, da emergência climática. Então, obrigada.
Bom, nesse momento, nós convidamos os participantes do Seminário Internacional Multirisco para prestigiarem os trabalhos que vão ser apresentados na sessão de trabalhos aqui em frente ao auditório. Aproveitamos para registrar o agradecimento aos nossos apoiadores, né? A Coordenação de Aperfeiçoamento de Pessoal de Nível Superior, a CAPES, a Secretaria Nacional de Periferias do Ministério das Cidades, o Centro de Ciências Humanas, Letras e Artes da UFRN, o Ecomuseu de Pacoti e a Sociedade Brasileira de Ecologia Humana. Após o almoço, nós aguardamos todos os inscritos no workshop do projeto Multirisco, neste auditório. Né? Neste momento, nós teremos a participação do professor Philip Ward, da Universidade Livre de Amsterdã, e do Wilson Correia, morador do bairro Mãe Luísa, que é o destino da nossa visita técnica de amanhã. Então, nós queremos também informar que todos aqueles que se inscreveram na visita técnica, junto ao local do credenciamento, deverão nos encontrar às 9 horas da manhã. Né? Nós não teremos atividade aqui no Auditório Ágora, iremos todos nos reunir na base da escadaria de Mãe Luísa. Caso exista alguma dúvida em relação ao endereço, ao ponto de encontro, por favor, contatem os membros da equipe. Desejamos, então, bons debates e que você se direcione, então, à sessão de trabalhos. Um bom dia a todos.